Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happen to be watching this lecture. Today we're going to focus our conversation on American religious culture from 1865 to roughly about World War I. What happened in the late 19th and early 20th century to create a characteristic set of cultural and social circumstances for American religion and Christianity to take a particular shape. Setting ourselves up with some of the cultural basics and historical basics so we can make sense out of what eventually became the divide between fundamentalists and liberals. We're going to challenge actually that fundamental dichotomy next week, but that's where we'll be spending our time and energy next week in figuring that part out. Tonight, by way of conversation and getting us rolling, I want to introduce a few basic themes of American life in this era that will help set the context for our conversation. The first is that we're rapidly spreading west. The process of manifest destiny and spreading American life, culture, and liberty across the Appalachians in the 1830s and 40s across into the West was completed by 1912. 1912, Arizona was the last state in the lower 48 to be added to the United States. So we are now a nation moving across the rest of the continent all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. The development of that led to a whole new series of cultural questions and challenges, some of which we'll discuss tonight. The second key theme is the theme of immigration. Between 1865 and 1920, almost 30 million immigrants came to the United States, the vast majority of them coming from Europe. There was a little bit of a change around 1880 or 90 or so, where we switched primarily from Northern and Western European immigrants to Southern and Eastern European immigrants, whereas it was the English and the Germans and the Irish and others in the earlier part of the 19th century eventually switched primarily to the Greeks and the Italians, the Poles, and other Southern and Eastern European immigrants. To give you an idea about what that number, almost 30 million, means, in 1865, at the conclusion of the Civil War, demographers estimate that there were about 35 million people living in the United States. So almost that entire population came through European immigration, and then through immigration as well as natural increase. By 1920, there were 106 million people living in the United States. So massive, massive economic and cultural and population growth. And part of that is the third theme tonight of the rise of urbanization. Those immigrants, not exclusively, but largely, were dumping into America's large cities. Here's a few numbers to think about in terms of the drive of urban industrialization and some of the social issues and opportunities that arose for ministry in this particular context. In 1800, only about 6% of the United States population lived in what we call urban areas, and that's urban, right, meaning towns of about 2,500 people or more. By 1850, that number had more than doubled to 15%, and by 1900, that number was 40%. So more and more and more Americans were living in urban environments. The number of cities with more than 100,000 residents grew from 2 in 1820. Those were just New York and Philadelphia, leading up to the Civil War. And by 1900, there were 38 cities in the United States with more than 100,000 residents. New York City's population grew from 60,000 in 1800 to 3.5 million by 1900. And Chicago, what many have called the city of the century in the 19th century, the population went from literally maybe 50 people, certainly less than 100 in 1800, to more than 1 million in 1900. This was also part and parcel of the growth of the Industrial Revolution, particularly from 1820 to about 1870, that fueled urban growth, attracting millions and millions of people to work in factories across urban America. Eventually, people from the Deep South, the African American migration north in the 20th century, they would join these factory workers, but most of these factory workers were European immigrants coming into the United States in the 19th century. Part of that whole process, right, of the Industrial Revolution, the arrival of immigrants, is a complete change in what America looked like at this particular time. The estimate in 1910 in Chicago is that 80 to 85% of residents of Chicago in 1910 spoke a first language other than English. And one demographer has estimated that the population density in and around what is now the Circle campus of the UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago, around Jane Addams Hull House in that part of Chicago, was roughly consistent with today's Calcutta in India. Right, so this was a teeming, shifting identity of what it meant to be an American in this particular time. The fourth broad theme is globalization. The United States during this period became an international power through global business and military expansion. In 1893, we absorbed Hawaii as a protectorate and territory of the United States. In 1898, we fought the Spanish-American War and took on protectorates of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Eventually, in 1900, Cuba became a protectorate of the United States, and also Panama. We participated in the Panama Revolution and built the Panama Canal as part of American territory that wasn't returned until the Panamanians until the 1970s. There's also a key theme here that I wanted to at least mention that we'll sort of begin and end our time with tonight, is this conversation about whether or not salvation is an individual or a social concept. Salvation is oftentimes seen by certain fundamentalists and super evangelical conservatives as, and not even that actually, just by sort of standard American Christians, as primarily an individual phenomenon, that we address individual sin and are saved by grace and saved so that we can go to heaven. Others in this period, we'll talk about the rise of the social gospel, began to think more and more about salvation as a societal or a social phenomenon. That it's not just about you going to heaven and covering your own sinfulness, but achieving the kingdom of God in the present and addressing social issues as part of God's plan for salvation for the world. And the question really is, theologically and conceptually, do individual salvation and social justice have to be seen as two fundamentally different things? I think in this period, we have certain examples of them being wed together as the two sides of the same social reform coin, but eventually those two mindsets begin to shift in the late 19th and early 20th century, at least in the popular imagination, and we'll start to understand where some of those distinctions come from. The other thing I just want to mention, too, about this rise at this particular time is the growth of biblical criticism and higher criticism of the Bible. We're not going to talk about that this week. That'll be our conversation next week as we talk about the rise of fundamentalism and the intellectual challenge to some of those 19th century trends. But I do think it's important to recognize that changes in intellectual trends and the way that we understand and study the Bible are also key in this late 19th century in the formation of what will become evangelical theology. And then I just want to end with kind of a brief discussion tonight of introductory work about the key goals of American Protestants in this period. And then we'll unpack those for the rest of our conversation tonight. First was to evangelize the entire population of the world. In fact, they really did believe evangelism in our generation. We can bring Christ to the entire world. The reform of both personal and public life, individual moral reform and behavior, prohibition and moral discipline for individuals, as well as the reform of public life and justice. Third was this commitment to redeeming the cities they had become, which some saw as a threat to traditional Christian values. And we had to address the social ills and the inequity and the inequality that existed in American citizens and help people out in cities in very practical ways. And then fourth was to unify Protestantism. It had been so splintered and divided in the late 19th century through denominations and other organizations. The idea was to, through the ecumenical movement, to bring it back together in unity. And we'll spend some time tonight talking about all those things. First we're going to talk primarily about what happened to American evangelism and missions in the 19th century. And the key figure here is Dwight L. Moody, the founder of Moody Bible Institute and Moody Church on Chicago's Near North Side, and a central figure in the unfolding of American evangelical theological and evangelism identity in the late 19th century. He was active in what was known in 1857 and 1858 as the Businessmen's Awakening or Revival, largely promoted by urban merchants and primarily in northern cities as a revival of religion in the late 1850s. The Businessmen's Awakening was a religious revival that emerged as part of the broader, what some people call the Third Great Awakening in the United States, of which Moody was really the archetype. It was triggered by an economic panic. The late 19th century saw sort of a pattern of economic boom and bust. In 1857, there was a bust, an economic downturn that led many businessmen to seek solace in religion, fostering a significant spiritual movement. The movement began by an organizer named Jeremiah Lanphier, a lay missionary in the North Dutch Church in New York City in September of 1857. The initial meetings were small, but they quickly grew to other cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and even Chicago, where Moody was active. They were primarily attended by businessmen as well as working class men. They focused on non-denominational midday prayer meetings in urban centers, making it accessible for working professionals. And unlike earlier revivals, there was actually little emotion. Meetings were primarily ordered, structured, and centered on prayer rather than emotional, evocative sermons. The movement expanded rapidly across the United States and even reached parts of Canada and even Europe. It influenced churches of various denominations, leading to increased church attendance as well as more conversions. But it also had a significant impact across American culture. The first was that it actually strengthened participation and increased the number of prayer meetings across the country. This idea of businessmen gathering for prayer, either midday or before work, became a common phenomenon in the late 19th century, early 20th century. It also provided spiritual support for businessmen who were facing financial uncertainty during this panic of the late 1850s. It also had practical business effect to promote ethical business practices and influencing moral behavior in commerce, and also created a sense of unity among different social classes through shared religious experience. And finally, I would say that it also had an influence on future revivals. It paved the way for larger evangelical revivals in the late 19th century and inspired figures like Dwight Moody, who we'll now talk about tonight. D.L. Moody was a participant not only in this businessmen's revival, but also the YMCA. The YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, was a new volunteer society that was created in 1844. If you're interested in this, we don't have a lot of time to talk about it tonight, but it's part of this movement that started in the 1840s of what we call muscular Christianity. The idea that you get out and lift weights and play sports and be a guy and be a Christian leader, right? This idea of masculinity as part of an expression of Christian faith and evangelism. Part of the development of the YMCA was not just a threat to traditional masculinity and manhood, but also the realization that there was an increasing immigration from Ireland as well as Germany at this time. There was a threat in the decline of what people referred to as Anglo-Saxonism or Anglo-Saxon identity in the United States, and a desire to reclaim the role that Anglo-Saxons would play in American religion and in American culture, and the preservation of that particular cultural mindset with strength and influence. D.L. Moody himself, eventually, he was born in New England, but made his way to Chicago shortly before the Civil War. He took an active role in the YMCA and also the burgeoning Sunday school movement, which was designed to bring a general Christian influence to the growing immigrant city by bringing families and particularly young people and children into the church and instructing them in the basics of the Christian faith. He was accompanied by Ira Sankey, who was a song leader, which really shows sort of a standard fare now in the 19th and 20th century, that major evangelists were always accompanied by powerful song leaders. And sort of that duo between Moody and Sankey set that sort of combo in place that has been present really throughout American life all the way into the present, the importance of song in the process of religious awakenings. Dwight L. Moody was not as emotionally evocative and as was Whitefield before him in the earlier part of the 19th century. But he sort of developed a new style and a personal emphasis on personal holiness as well as social reform. He saw himself primarily as a winner of souls. So while he committed to social reform and believed in ministering to people in the city, he certainly was not more along the sort of social justice angle that future advocates of the social gospel would be. His basic fundamental Christian message relied on what he called the 3 R's. The fact that you're ruined by sin, you're redeemed by Christ, and then you're regenerated by the power of the Holy Ghost for ongoing holy living. He told very, very practical, straightforward, easy to understand stories about the important role that Christ should play in the life of the average person. He liked to tell a story, for example, of a father who took a young child into a field on a Sunday afternoon. And while the child was sort of playing about in the park, the father fell asleep, and when he awoke, he searched with rising panic for the child, only eventually to find that the child had tumbled over a precipice to his death. Moody's moral characteristic was very clear. He said this, "I thought, as I read that, what a picture of the Church of God. How many fathers and mothers, how many Christian men and women are sleeping now while their children wander over the terrible precipice right into the bottomless pit. Father, mother, where is your boy tonight?" Right? This sort of evocative evangelistic message of you could die, your family could die at any moment. Are you paying attention? Are you caring for your family? Are you caring for your own salvation and your own eternal future? He developed a Bible training center, now the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. He started summer missions conferences that were oftentimes dominated by discussions of the end times in Northfield, Massachusetts. And he also was very active in what we'll talk about a little bit later in the student volunteer movement, a movement in the late 19th century that moved college students and high school students to move strongly and with strong commitment to seek, quote, the evangelization of the world in this generation, unquote. Again, the student volunteer movement was a huge thing that I studied when I was at Wheaton as an undergraduate. To this day, Wheaton has something they call the missionary wall. If you are a mission, I'm not sure if they still put graduates on there or not. They might. But throughout almost the entire 20th century, there was a wall at Wheaton that if you graduated from Wheaton and went into full-time missionary service, you got your name on that wall. The central importance of a feature of American evangelicalism in the 19th and early 20th century of global missions as the ultimate showing of true Christian discipleship and commitment. I want to talk for just a minute about sort of the key impact of Moody's revivals. The first was a popularized new evangelical style, a new evangelism style. He moved away from that fire and brimstone preaching that was emotional and the fire of the pit of hell and the threat of hell, and instead focused on God's love, grace, and personal salvation. His simple and direct preaching made evangelical Christianity more accessible to an urban audience, especially to working class people. Second, he adapted evangelicalism to an urban setting. Unlike previous revivals, which often focused in small or rural America, small town America, he targeted industrial cities like Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. He used large halls and tents set up in or outside of town and auditoriums to accommodate thousands of people who attended. And he tailored his message to factory workers and businessmen and the poor, addressing their struggles with industrialization and urban life. Third, he promoted a non-denominational evangelicalism. His revivals were interdenominational. He welcomed Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, others. It sort of weakened some denominational divisions and encouraged a broader, united evangelical movement that is absolutely essential as we move into fundamentalism and evangelicalism of the 20th century. And then finally, he also introduced new evangelistic methods. what we call mass evangelism, large-scale revival meetings that inspired later figures like Billy Sunday and Billy Graham. Music, as I mentioned with Ira Sankey, who introduced gospel hymns as a key revival tool that made worship more engaging and enlivening and inspiring for people who attended the revivals. He provided personal testimony and lay preaching. He encouraged ordinary believers to share their stories of faith and to be actively involved in the process of evangelism. Not only evangelists preaching to big audiences, but everyone becoming an evangelist in their own circle of influence. He also linked evangelism with social reform. Though he avoided direct involvement in politics, he supported temperance and education and urban outreach. Moody Bible Institute was designed to train missionaries and lay leaders, and he promoted Sunday schools and urban mission and aid for the poor, linking faith with social action. But at the end of the day, he saw himself primarily as a savior of souls, of individual salvation and individual moral rigor. And then finally, he really inspired the rise of fundamentalism and modern evangelicalism. He laid the groundwork for American fundamentalism that emerged in the early 20th century by emphasizing biblical inerrancy and the importance of sharing your own personal gospel story through evangelistic commitment. His revivalistic style influenced later evangelists, like I mentioned, Billy Graham and Billy Sunday, shaping the mass evangelism model of the 20th century, eventually with missionaries preaching to literally hundreds of thousands of people in one sitting. Before we finish this particular lecture and get on to the rest of our conversation, I want to talk a little bit about a style of end times understanding and theology that eventually D.L. Moody came to adopt, that he adopted from an Irish thinker by the name of John Nelson Darby, called dispensational premillennialism. This is absolutely essential for understanding the forerunner of American evangelicalism, especially of American fundamentalism, and what people thought about the end times. And I want to talk a little bit about that movement now, to give you an understanding of this style of thinking, kind of where it came from, and then we can address some further conversations and questions in class about where this came from and how it developed. Dispensational premillennialism is a Christian theological system that interprets biblical history and prophecy through distinct periods or dispensations in which God interacts with humanity in different ways. It's associated with John Nelson Darby and became influential in fundamentalist and evangelical circles in the 19th and 20th century. I'm actually going to take a second here to enlarge this picture. Forgive this brief change. I'm going to take this slide and I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to get rid of this stuff and I'm going to enlarge this picture so we can take a closer look at it here in just a minute. Because I do think that one of the things that dispensational thinkers do is they create these charts, right, of what the end times are going to look like. And so we'll spend a couple minutes talking about this chart here in just a minute. The key thing of sort of the background of dispensational premillennial thinking is this idea that history is divided into 7 distinct periods or dispensations, each with a different divine plan and a different way that God was active, very specifically circumscribed God's actions at that particular time. Those 7 dispensations are innocence, the period of Adam and Eve; conscience, post-fall; human government, this was from Noah to Babel; the promise, which was from Abraham to Moses; 5 was the law, Moses to Jesus Christ; 6 was grace, which we called the church age, in which we are currently living, the current church age; and then 7 was the kingdom, or the millennial reign of Christ. Premillennialism meant that Christ will return before a literal 1,000-year reign on earth. And that literal return of Jesus Christ will take place before a very specific period of time, a 7-year period of time that is preceded by an event called the rapture. Before the tribulation, Believers will be secretly taken up or raptured into heaven, sparing them from end times judgments. This is Tim LaHaye, whose thinking was popularized in a series of books in the 1990s and early 21st century that became known very well for teaching this particular understanding of what the end times are going to look like. Let's take a second and just look at that chart that I showed you, right? This is, again, this sort of very specific understanding of what the end times are going to look like. And here is, by the way, this is all leading up to, Daniel's 69 weeks. It's all the prophecy of Daniel, how Revelation is unfolded over time. Here's the millennial kingdom, eventually the perfect kingdom. All of this is done with a very circumscribed, very specific understanding of periods of global history and how God interacts with the world. And whenever you see fundamentalist or dispensational preachers, they always have some sort of chart of the end of the age like this that they will regularly refer to. There's also an important distinction here that for this type of thinking, that God has a very separate plan for Israel and the rest of the church. The church belongs to the present age of grace, or the church age dispensation, while Israel as a people will play a very specific role in future prophecy. This, of course, precedes Israel as a nation state, and modern dispensational premillennialists actually interpret the modern state of Israel to be the same as the biblical Israel, with a very specific understanding of the Jewish people and the Jewish nation state in end times. Key also to this is a literal interpretation of Old Testament prophecy. They believe that the biblical prophecies of Daniel and Revelation should be taken literally rather than symbolically, and you can actually plot out how they are proven over time throughout history. And then there's that emphasis on the final judgment and new creation, where after the millennium, Satan will be defeated, leading to the great white throne judgment, and God will create a new heaven and a new earth, and we'll all live with God. A very specific understanding of the end times and why that was absolutely essential for understanding the Christian faith. If that's sort of a basic summary of what dispensational premillennialism actually is, I want to take just a minute to talk about why it is absolutely important beyond just the actual specific teachings. Number one, it popularized the rapture, this pre-tribulation rapture, which was widely accepted and adopted across evangelical thinking after D.L. Moody. The result, right, I will argue next week as we get into the early 20th century, is the eventual reversal of evangelical commitment to social reform. Starting with Jonathan Edwards and others, they were what we would call post-millennial. They actually believed that it was the Christian's responsibility to redeem the world and make it a better place. Throughout the 19th century, we also see the development later on. In our next lecture, we'll talk about the social gospel that sees the Christian's duty to actually help solve social ills that are being created through urbanization and industrialization. But if you believe that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and just when things are about to get their very worst, all believers in Christ are going to be sort of raptured and lifted out of this evil world and brought into heaven, there will then be a period of tribulation and a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, and there'll be all kinds of warfare and battle and death and destruction and suffering before there's a final recreation and a redemption in the eternal heaven and the eternal earth. If that's what you truly believe, right, salvation becomes more and more about protecting yourself for future glory rather than committing to transforming the world that you currently live in. Right, so this popularization of the rapture is an absolutely central understanding to what happens to the abandonment of the evangelical commitment to social reform of the 19th century that happens really in the early 20th century. It also influenced modern evangelicalism His ideas were spread widely through what became known as one of the first study Bibles. A guy by the name of Scofield published a reference Bible in 1909 that filled the side marginal text of the Bible with very specific dispensational premillennial interpretations of Scripture and prophecy, outlining exactly how prophecies were being fulfilled and how they would be fulfilled. And it really has sort of an indelible imprint on American evangelicalism that we will unpack next week. It also shaped American evangelical eschatology, our understanding of what the end times will be like. Remember that the rapture is not really a biblical concept, and neither is it an aspect of Christian theology before the mid part of the 19th century. But eventually, not only did it influence people like D.L. Moody, but Hal Lindsey, the late great Planet Earth, Tim LaHaye, who also was involved as a co-author of the Left Behind series that sold millions of books, about 20, 25 years ago, and many contemporary Bible prophecy teachers, right? So it became a mainstay of what we think the end of the world will actually look like. So we'll spend some time unpacking that, but I just wanted to spend some time there. Happy to answer more questions when we get together in class on Tuesday night. Today's second lecture will now focus on missions, missionary entrepreneurs, and the rise of social reform and moral reform in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I'll see you in a minute when you click over to the next lecture. Thanks. Bye.